everyone, I'm Kito Sitze, and in this video we are going to be exploring a type of observational study, specifically case control studies. To give some context, studies can generally be divided into two types, observational and experimental. Observational studies can be further grouped into three main types, cross-sectional, case control, and cohort studies. In this video, we'll be focusing on case control studies. When critically evaluating or conducting a case control study, there are a few key features that need to be considered. Let's look at the purpose of case control studies. These studies aim to identify associations or potential risk and protective factors by comparing past exposures between cases and controls. Case control studies are particularly useful for understanding the risk and protective factors that may contribute to a specific condition or disease. For us to study risk and protective factors, we need to compare a group of people who have a condition, say perinatal psychosis, to a similar group of people who do not have the condition. Those with the condition are called cases, and those without the condition are called controls. Case control studies are useful for studying rare conditions or diseases. Since cases are selected based on the presence of the outcome, the condition or the disease, case control studies are especially valuable for investigating diseases with a low prevalence or diseases that take a long time to develop. The example of perinatal psychosis is a good example of an outcome for a case control study, given its low prevalence. Case control studies start by recruiting individuals who have the outcome of interest, say perinatal psychosis, as cases. If you just did a cross-sectional study, you may need to speak to thousands of women before you find one case of perinatal psychosis. It's helpful to think of case control studies as looking back in time. This is the second key feature of a case control study. Case control studies capture data from looking into the past. Just by nature, they are retrospective because the outcome, let's say schizophrenia, has already happened. You select your cases based on this outcome, and you select your controls based on them not having this outcome. In this example, not having schizophrenia. It's always important to remember that case control studies are a type of observational study design. Researchers do not manipulate variables or intervene in any way. We leave this for experimental designs. In observational studies, we observe and collect data as it naturally occurred. Finally, case control studies cannot establish causality or track changes over time. They have low internal validity. They are designed to identify associations or potential risk or protective factors by comparing cases, those with a condition, and controls, those without the condition. The third key feature of case control studies are the research questions they can answer. Here are a few examples. Is a history of childhood trauma associated with the development of depression in adolescence? In this example, the cases are adolescents diagnosed with depression, while the controls are adolescents without a diagnosis of depression. The exposure being examined is the presence or absence of childhood trauma, which is assessed through questionnaires or clinical records. The data analysis would involve comparing childhood trauma between the two groups to determine whether there's an association between childhood trauma and developing depression. Let's explore another research question. Is social media usage linked to severe social phobia in young adults? In this case control study, young adults diagnosed with severe social phobia would serve as the cases, while those without social phobia would be the controls. The exposure of interest is social media usage, which could be measured through questionnaires or digital tracking tools to assess the amount and type of use. The data analysis would compare the social media habits of the two groups to explore whether there's an association between social media usage and severe social phobia in young adults. Understanding how to do a case control study is key feature number 4. From the examples I provided, you should have an idea how a researcher would conduct a case control study. Let's explore another example. In this example, the researcher is interested in conducting a case control study to answer the question, is vaping associated with respiratory conditions among adolescents? In this example, we would first find our cases. These would be adolescents who have developed a rare respiratory condition. Perhaps we identify potential participants using hospital records. Next, we would select our controls, adolescents without the rare respiratory condition. We would then measure the exposure of interest in both our case and control groups. This would be whether or not they have a history of vaping, along with other potential risk or protective factors that we identified from the literature. Finally, we would analyze the data to determine whether there's an association between vaping and the development of rare respiratory conditions in adolescents. You might be thinking to yourself, this sounds pretty straightforward. Cases are individuals who have the outcome of interest. In our example, a respiratory condition, while controls are individuals without the outcome. Control adolescents are chosen to be similar to cases with certain characteristics that match. This may be done using gender and age or other characteristics. For example, a 14-year-old female case is matched with a 14-year-old female control. Matching should not be done for the exposure being studied. So in our example, we don't match those who don't vape in the case group with those who don't vape in the control group. This is the possible association you're trying to study. You are asking the question, is vaping associated with rare respiratory conditions? If you match them on the exposure being studied, you will not see any difference between cases and controls for this exposure. That's why a matching variable cannot be analyzed as a risk or protective factor. Key feature number 5 in case control studies is data collection. Data can be collected through questionnaires, interviews, or observations. These can be demographic, social, behavioral, or health-related variables, depending on the study's focus. Similar to other types of observational studies, in case control studies, researchers can assess multiple variables at the same time. We would just have to be mindful of participant fatigue so we don't make our questionnaires too long. Remember that both the exposure group and the control groups are asked the same questions. Moving on to key feature number 6. It's important to consider the potential biases in the sampling method and data collection. Case control studies are susceptible to a number of biases. First, selection bias can happen when controls and cases are not well selected. In case control studies, this bias can be particularly problematic because improper selection of cases and controls can lead to inaccurate conclusions. If an adolescent was diagnosed with a respiratory condition when they actually don't have a condition, this misclassification would interfere with the groups. They would have to be included in the cases group, but they should have been included in the control group. Next, observer bias is a concern in case control studies when the person collecting the data unintentionally influences the results. This can happen because of their knowledge of a participant's status as being a case or control. Finally, recall bias can happen when participants are asked to remember past exposures, and their memories may be inaccurate. Those with a condition being studied, cases, may remember certain exposures differently or more clearly than those without the condition, the controls. Maybe a case adolescent who vapes regularly remembers how much they vaped each day, each time they cough. But a control adolescent hasn't really thought about their vaping habits much. Differences in how people remember things can change the accuracy of the connection between an event or condition and its effects. Masking or blinding researchers and participants can help reduce observer bias in case control studies. If the research team are unaware of certain aspects of the study, most important whether a participant is part of a case or control group, they are less likely to influence the data. If you know an adolescent has a respiratory condition, you may keep asking questions about vaping as you think there's an association. Then for the control adolescents, you may not probe as much. Maybe you'd ask one question, have you ever used a vape? If they say no, you may just have moved on. You can see how masking or blinding can ensure more reliable and unbiased data collection. Another consideration when it comes to case control studies is taking note of reporting guidelines. The Equator Network website is very helpful when it comes to identifying appropriate reporting guidelines, as you can see from the list. Equator stands for Enhancing the Quality and Transparency of Health Research. The most commonly used guideline for cross-sectional and other epi-observational studies is STROBE. strengthening the reporting of observational studies in epidemiology. If you look for the study design specific strobe guidelines, you'll be able to see a checklist for case control studies specifically. Putting all of this information together, case control studies have several major strengths. First, they're relatively quick, easy, and cheap to conduct because they look at the data retrospectively. This eliminates the need for a long-term follow-up and reduces costs. Secondly, these studies allow researchers to investigate a wide range of risk factors or exposures for a single outcome. This provides a broad understanding of potential causes. Third, case control studies are especially useful for studying rare diseases. Researchers can start with the cases where the disease has already occurred, avoiding the need to wait for the condition to develop. Finally, a case control study typically requires a smaller sample size compared to cohort studies or experimental studies, making them more manageable in terms of both resources and logistics. Case control studies also come with major limitations. One of the primary challenges is that it's difficult to establish temporal relationships between exposures and outcomes. This means that it's hard to determine whether the exposure has truly occurred before the disease developed. A condition such as a respiratory condition can go undiagnosed for a while. Maybe some adolescents started vaping after the condition was already there. This leads to lower internal validity. Lower internal validity means that we can't say that one variable caused change in another. These studies are also highly susceptible to various biases, particularly selection of observer and recall bias. Additionally, case control studies cannot measure the incidence, the number of new cases, or prevalence of a condition in a population. They're designed to compare people with and without the condition rather than track disease's occurrence over time. Lastly, these studies are limited to assessing only one outcome or condition. This means that they are less flexible when it comes to exploring multiple health conditions. I hope that you found this video helpful in understanding the key features of a case control study. As a reminder, here's a list of 10 things to consider when planning or assessing an observational study, whether it's a cross-sectional or case control or cohort. Thank you for listening.